Legacy's new hot tech.
Next on Eternal Turtles.
Stop! I need more stuff. Can't you see I need more stuff? But I will go.
Big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters. If you want to support the channel, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurtles. In return, you'll get ad-free content and a bonus episode every single week. Thanks for watching. Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Bleckman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Zach, have you ever thought about when tech comes along that sort of makes you want to experiment with altering the foundations of like how Legacy is built?
Yeah, I definitely, every now and again, every time like a new set comes out, I'm always looking for like that one thing, that like one pivot point that like, we got Aether Drift coming up, maybe there'll be something in there. But I'm always looking for that like one card that like might either like renew an archetype or like change how a deck fundamentally is built. It happens every now and again in Legacy, but those cards are few and far between or extremely powerful when they happen. But I think what you're talking about more is like, sort of the like hidden gems, the things that like change how you think about building decks in the format.
Yeah, there was we are in all of the Discords for all of the things. We talk a lot of Magic outside of this podcast. Like on this podcast, we talk a lot of Magic, obviously, but outside of this podcast, we also talk a lot of Magic just in our everydays. And we have our YouTube channel, and we have the website now. If you want to write for the website, you DM me. You reach out.
We're doing doing so much, man. I don't know how you keep up
so,
with all the editing and stuff.
So the way that I can, I do, it is a heavy load to edit all the things on top of like day job and stuff. But, you did send me to try out Magic Mind. I know we talked about it a couple of times ago, and I'm usually not a believer in that stuff. But like, I also drink like, I don't know, 2 full things of coffee a day. Like definitely too much. I think like my ability to speak a million miles a minute like is suggestive of how much caffeine I actually
for
take.
Sure. Yeah.
And I'm like, it would be nice to not have something caffeine oriented. And you were like, yeah, hey, dude, just try this because it worked for me. And I was like, okay. So I tasted it. It's not too bad. It's actually pretty good. It's like it tastes like almost like a green shot or whatever, and it's good. It's like, I don't know, it's nice. And even if it's placebo effect, it still felt healthier than what I was doing before. And has been able to like keep me sharp to like churn through the fact that I'm like both editing for the site and for my day job and for a bunch of other side work while we keep trying to like get our way to 6,000 subscribers by the end of 2025. And I
used it all through December, and they sent me another packet as well that came with like the energy version, and then also the sleep version too. And I've been doing the sleep and the energy like kind of back to back.
I've only done the focus. I haven't done the sleep or the energy yet. I mean, I'm saying this as I'm drinking a cup of coffee, but it's also to drink one. But I have used them, and they are good. And I know we got a link to whatever if other people want to try it too. It's magicmind.com/DurtlesJan. It's a bundle code. It'll be in our link in description. Check it out. It's good.
I'm going to tell people a little bit about the sleep stuff real fast, because that was pretty cool.
Oh yeah, you tried that one.
The idea here is that it helps you go to sleep, almost like melatonin or something like that would. But like I wake up with melatonin, man. I wake up and I'm like, oh, I just want to go back to sleep. With this, like I was like, boom, I'm up, I'm ready to go. Like it was kind of nice to be like, that's how. Yeah, it was just like nice to be like, okay, cool. Like I am asleep, bam. I never have trouble going to sleep. I'm just one of those weirdos that like, when I close my eyes, I decide I'm asleep, and then I'm asleep, and then my wife just sits up next to me staring at me the entire night. But it's hard to wake up normally. This was nice. It's just like, boom, I'm awake. Like my alarm went off. I'm like, okay, get up, get dressed, go to work, So that was good. But with that said, you were saying we have a code.
Magicmind.com/Durdles, plural, Jan, DURDLESJAN. That gets you 45% off a Magic Mind bundle if you want to try the stuff 45. That we're drinking.
Nice.
45, yeah, it's pretty good. So give it a go. Anyway, to talk about why I was drinking it, is because in the Control discourse and everybody trying to like make something happen over the last 2 episodes, which have gotten a bunch of traction about Control being dead or whatever, people are now just like they're going real spaghetti with it, Zach, real spaghetti. And the stuff that I found really intriguing about a bunch of this stuff is there's sometimes tech that doesn't otherwise see play because it intrinsically conflicts with what the like foundational structure of how you build decks in Legacy are. So the big one that I want to talk about today that I've been thinking about a ton, and then it is making me think about other ways to manipulate the way that decks are built, is fetch lands are the most broken thing in Magic, right? Of course,
Sure, we'll go with that.
Zach, they're the most broken thing. So why would anybody
For the
not
sake
want
of
to
this
play with
argument.
fetch lands? Well, if there was a powerful enough tool to target the metagame that would be valuable enough for you to be like, if I'm willing to concede playing with fetch lands, would this tool be enough to essentially offset the discrepancy between what the most powerful decks are doing and my ability to stop them? And that card is Suppression Field. Now, Suppression Field is 1 and a white. It's an enchantment that says all activated abilities cost an additional 2 to activate. Now, this is valuable because it essentially just turns off Nadu, right? Like the Nadu combo can't happen because activated abilities will just be taxed at such a rate that you just can't do it. Similarly, also, it shuts off activated abilities that I'm actually just going to read the straight text. That way I'm not telling you lies, but I've been thinking about it a lot. So Suppression Field, 1 and a white. It literally just says activated abilities cost 2 more to play. In this case, activate unless they're mana abilities. So your mana dorks, your Lotus Petals, your LEDs, all of those are mana abilities, so they don't get taxed by Suppression Field, but everything else does. Now, that includes Urza Saga making constructs. That includes anything that would copy a Dark Depths. That includes Wasteland activating. It would cost 2 to activate. It includes Fetch Lands, Zach. Fetch Lands costing 2 to activate to actually fetch is difficult. And it's why Suppression Field typically only shows up in decks that otherwise don't have fetch lands to begin with, like mono white D&T and stuff like that. Yeah. So the thought here is if Suppression Field is, let's assume the position that Suppression Field is a powerful enough tool against the current format. Now, granted, it doesn't stop things like it doesn't stop a reanimator that's going under, right? It comes down on turn 2.
Yeah.
But it does turn off cycling. Now, turn off meaning like instead of 1 to cycle, it's 3 to cycle.
And that's 3 for a Troll Khazad-dûm. No.
Very different, right? Yeah. Very different. Now, it also, like, there are some decks that have been dabbling with, like, Emperor of Bones and stuff like that. That's an activated ability to get the recursion, to the reanimate effect on it. And it costing 4 instead of 2 is a huge difference in terms of, like, how much gameplay you have in between dying. And, like, similarly, activated abilities also includes Planeswalkers, Zach. If your Tameo wants to crack a clue, it's going to cost 4. If your Tameo wants to activate an ability, it's going to cost 2 for every activated ability. Now, all of that is that is a lot of circumstantial effects, right? That are sort of broad scoped across a lot of the format. And if this one card not only shuts off, potentially hosing in terms of like hitting somebody's fetch lands, which is a wasteland effectively, right? Because the fetch land can't produce mana until it actually fetches. So that means that they need an additional 2 natural land drops in order to go. If they're in multiple fetches, it's going to be tough for them. They can't cycle for their mana. They're not going to be able to wasteland you off of stuff. It's a 2-drop. Of course, like there's game to be played before you hit 2 mana and they can fight over it, whatever. But if it sticks, it's just doing a lot against everything in the format. If you're looking at Painter, all right, well, your Grindstone's going to cost 5 instead of 3. That's a huge difference.
That's a lot.
It's a lot.
Not to mention, if you get rid of the Grindstone, it still costs mana for them to use the Welders or to use the that's amazing.
It's all of that, and then it also hits against like Red Stompy and stuff. People on what's the goblin that flings shit and destroys everything and has menace and haste. Bombardiers Boast. Yeah. Boast is an activated ability. It feels a lot of the time like it's a triggered ability, but it's not. Boast can happen anytime after they've attacked. It's an activated ability after the fact. So if they want to fling something, they can't just like start going off. They have to spend 2 mana to actually boast. That's also significant because that can slow them down by a full turn cycle of what it would be like to kill you. If you have problems with One Ring, activated ability of the One Ring costing 2 additional mana on top of the upkeep cost, that's significant. Like 2 mana is a lot in this format.
It's 2 mana, and that's 2 mana. They don't have to cast any spells afterwards if they're drawing. Like if you draw like 6 cards and everything in your deck costs 1 mana over the course of the game, right? Like all of those 1 manas are spells that every mana is spells that they didn't get to cast, right? Like So that becomes a big problem for a deck like that, especially if you're playing like against Mystic Forge or something, right? Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield.com. Moxfield is the best deck building website on the internet. You can find all of my and Phil's decks in links below, including decks from this episode. And if you do, you'll be directly supporting the channel.
The other thing that was also appealing to me is like it's incidentally got some game against Ayavukin, which is valuable, particularly to me, right? Like instead of it costing 7+, it costs 9+, and that is an additional turn cycle. And you know, that is not always available to them in the same way. And if you get an additional turn, like that can be pretty significant. So between Painter and the activated abilities of Tameo coming in after Psychic Frog and Vexing Bauble got banned, and One Ring, and like there's just enough activated abilities going on in the format right now, on top of the fact that foundationally it's a Fetchland Wasteland format, that I'm like, oh, Suppression Field is really interesting. But if you're playing Suppression Field, this was designed in an era when these kinds of effects weren't asymmetrical like everything is nowadays.
Yeah.
So
you got to watch out.
Having a symmetrical effect means, okay, well, it's tough to play with your own fetch lands if you're taxing yourself, right? Like it becomes sort of a nombo, and that's why Suppression Field doesn't really show up all that much. Okay, but if we assume the position that Suppression Field is actually powerful enough to combat the current metagame, what would a deck without fetch lands actually look like that would also want to play Suppression Field? Now, of course, me being a control mage and wanting to see if that would work, I've been looking into what are the ways in which you could essentially build a fetchless mana base that is still effective at getting its colors that it needs when it needs them. And this is where I find that, like, you know, drinking the Magic Mind or whatever has been helpful in not making me go crazy. Because since years ago, the last time we talked about a paradigm shift in deck building, and we talked about how Ponder was just absorbed into all decks that weren't just tempo, right? Like Control and Miracles adopted 4x Ponder, and that was a significant overhaul to how decks were then built from then forward. And now it would be crazy to play without 4 Ponder unless your name is exactly Strifo. Yeah. And I think that, like, looking at it again, the furthering of that Xeroxing by adding the cyclers, whether that's Chola Khazad-dûm or Lorien Revealed, has only furthered that same sentiment of, like, minimizing how many lands you have in your deck to be just more potent, to have just a higher density of action in your deck. We see some amount of that with people playing MDFCs too, to offset their land count a little bit even further. Like, how lean can we go on how many actual physical lands we actually play versus these other things that can sort of supplant what lands do for you is, like, getting closer and closer to the point where, like, go ahead.
That's a defining factor in Legacy. I mean, ever since Brainstorm Fetch became a thing, I mean, it used to be like 20 land was the lowest you could go, right? Like, and then it was like, okay, well, we can do 16 and 4 wastelands, and it's like now it's like, you know, people are running 14 land mana bases with wastelands and stuff.
14 land mana bases with wasteland because they're assuming that because their wasteland can also act as a cycler, way to turn on a cycler, whether that's a Lorien Revealed or a Chola Khazad-dûm, that you have just more incidental mana sources in your deck that don't require you to have to draw a land if you don't want to. And so the higher in density that you can get in your deck, presumably the more powerful your deck is, right? If you have fewer dead draws in your deck, that would be mana sources. So, or a mana source that functionally is something else, like a troll just is an Entomb, right? Like it is both a land and an Entomb in one card. So thinking further onto this, when I was sold, I've had 4 Lorien Revealed in my control deck for a while now. And I like it because it's able to fetch Mystic Sanctuary. That's a whole nother thing. But I'm a believer in the Xeroxing plus Lorien Revealed in control to minimize the number of lands that you actually need to play. However, the issue with that, though, is when you're shaving lands, where are you shaving? Because you can't actually shave too far in your actual lands that produce mana.
Yeah.
And then fetch lands also don't produce mana, but do take up a land slot. So even though they're thinning your deck, they still take up a land slot when you're actually building your deck on paper. So if you're adding all of these ways to get lands out of your deck, okay, well, what lands are you actually cutting? You can't cut all the way down to no, or like too low on actual mana producing lands that then you can't cast your spells, or that you get too low and then you fetched all of them out and then your fetches late game just are dead draws. So there's this push and pull that I don't know if the Legacy community has really reconciled with, like, what that will eventually look like to be the most optimized. we still see like some sink into stupor and stuff like that, like, sort of come into some decks. So far, it seems like the farthest we've been able to go with it is what you were talking about: 14 land plus 4 Troll of Khazad-dûm tempo decks, or Reanimator.
But even that
tempo
is like fringe. Like most of the Reanimator decks are playing 16 lands.
Sure, but like it's lower than the 18 Delver strategies used to play.
That
Sometimes
used to be that was
19.
As low as you could go and not be like, I don't know. There was like an 8-land like Stompy deck that existed at one point.
Yeah, and this is there is some amount of push and pull there in that, like, old blue-red style tempo Delver shells were 18 lands with 4 Wasteland, but the Wastelands didn't have any way to actually cast any spells in the deck. Like, when Expressive Iteration was around in the format, there was no spell in your deck that Wasteland could actually cast if you weren't hard casting a Force of Will. Yeah. Everything cost color. So the mana part of Wasteland was just flavor text. It was otherwise just a spell. It wasn't like Young Pyromancer of old or Orcish Bowmaster now, where that colorless generic mana can actually cast a spell rather than just Wasteland an opponent. So we've seen historically that decks can go to essentially 14 lands because the Wasteland otherwise is not casting any spells, so it's not really a land. It's a spell that just costs a land drop to, disrupt the opponent.
Sure.
So 14 lands has really been the lowest we've ever really seen. And I'm like, okay, well, if Tempo and Delver could do that, and historically, Control eventually was able to, had to sort of follow that methodology of, if that's where the Days Wasteland shells go, and those Days Wasteland shells sort of dictate the pace of the format, then, the same way that Control had to optimize itself and sort of steal the tempo technology of lowering your land count and upping your Xerox count, or your Xerox templating, I wonder now if it's sort of in a similar space to do it again. Now, I've only thought of about this because I've been thinking about Suppression Field so much.
Yeah.
And so...
Fair.
So what would it look like? And so I'm looking at cards that essentially can act as fetch lands without needing an activated ability. And so I've been testing a card, Zach, and you're going to have to look this one up. I've been testing a card called Fountainport Bell.
Fountainport Belt?
Bell.
Fountainport Bell. I have no idea. I'm going to look it up.
It's a 1-mana artifact from Bloomburrow. It's just Draft Chafe. It's the generic card that you play that lets you, like, tutor a land in draft, so you can actually, like, play the game.
Sure,
so it's a 1-mana artifact. It says you can tutor your library for a basic land and put it on top, and then it has the activated ability of one tap sack it, draw a card. Now, yes, it has an activated ability with Suppression Field, but what it does, Zach, is it essentially is a 1-mana spell that ensures that you're gonna develop. You're gonna hit your land drop on the next turn, and then it replaces itself when it needs to. But the fact that if, let's say, you wanted to play a deck that was without fetches, you can increase your basic count, play Fountainport Bell and Lorien Revealed, and then all of these cards can potentially get online before you stick a Suppression Field. Now, I know Fountainport Bell is definitely not the ultimate answer, right? It's just where I've started, and enough to get me curious as to how far could you actually go if you were a Suppression Field deck, or if there was essentially a Suppression Field wing of decks that could combat the metagame that then alter how they build their mana bases with these other tools that WotC keeps printing to try and make sure that players don't flood or screw. Now, the interesting parts of what Fountain Bell has done, though, in my testing with it, is there's little intricacies that are kind of fun. You can fail to find, Zach. You don't have to.
You can just shuffle.
You can use it as 1-mana shuffle to draw a card.
Just shuffle.
Now, a lot of times, Ponder is blue, look at the top 3 cards of your deck, shuffle it, and draw a card.
Sure.
Sometimes you just use Ponder to shuffle your deck to change the top of it that you know anyway, and then draw a card.
Mm-hmm.
So Fountainport Bell doing all that is really interesting. It's created a little bit more dynamic in play than what you might expect. Additionally, something that we've talked about a lot, Zach, and why the being able to find your mana source off of a wasteland, off of colorless mana, is really important. We've talked about it previously with Sensei's Divining Top and how it was really important that, like, one of the biggest factors about why Sensei's Divining Top was powerful is that it let you cantrip off your planes. Like, instead of being able to go, Ponder Brainstorm, Preordain, which all require blue mana, you could play a basic planes and still actually, Xerox a bit. You could develop. And that's what Wasteland and I'm sorry, that's what Troll of Khazad-dûm and Lorien revealed also enable. We talked about that before. I get to, if I can develop on planes, but then still, cantrip, cycling my Lorien reveal to hit my land drop, that is pretty powerful. And so the notion that you can play Fountainport Bell off of your non-blue basics to then tutor, whatever colors you're missing, and then that can get around the need to play fetch land so you can support Suppression Field. There is some dynamic here.
There's something there. There's something there.
I'm bringing it up because it's really, really hard to sort of navigate this sort of stuff alone. Like these sort of overhauls. Like nobody does this stuff by themselves, or it would take too long by the time the next power crept thing comes in. But I'm curious if anybody else has sort of explored this aggro Xeroxing to where fetch lands aren't as necessary because there's these other tools that can sort of take the gambit. And then if you weren't playing fetch lands, what does that enable? Typically, we only look at fetch lands, and you know me, I would be very happy if fetch lands were just banned because I think the format would be more interesting everywhere. I think fetch lands are the worst part of the worst design of Magic, even if there's some intricacy there. But I think they enable way more degenerate shit than they do positive outcomes. Like all the Delve spells would otherwise not be banned. Deathrite Shaman would otherwise not be banned. A bunch of stuff like Wasteland and Loam locking. All of that happens because Wastelands just happen, or Wastelands because fetch lands just happen to be cards that can go to the graveyard pretty easily to maximize that stuff. Brainstorm gets significantly weaker without fetch lands in it. Same thing. All the cantripping does. But if there was, if we presumed that there was a world where fetch lands weren't the best thing to be doing because there was actual reason to do something else that is, as powerful. Now, don't get me wrong, Suppression Field isn't as powerful. But if we're assuming that we're in a metagame where Suppression Field is and it's worth doing, I wonder if anybody else has sort of explored into what a fetchless mana base would look like to support tools that are powerful enough to combat a metagame without doing it as a meme.
Yeah.
I'm still exploring. I'm in the Fountainport Bell space of exploration here, which I know is not the total outcome. But like, I feel like there's enough redundancy of how they have made it so that like these sort of tools in fetchless formats where they want people to be able to develop and hit their mana base without getting mana screwed or flooded in draft, like Fountainport Bells and similar effects, that maybe those things intrinsically are actually powerful enough if we were to Xerox down our mana base in ways that have just never been explored, because why would anybody ever explore anything other than a fetch mana base?
Yeah, I think that is the thing that a lot of people are going to come away with your discussion here is that, with Brainstorm, with Ponder, being able to manipulate the top of your deck and then like get rid of the cards that you don't want to see. It's tough.
Well, that's also part of it, right?
Yeah.
Because I have felt that, you're never going to catch me in a deck that's not playing for Ponder, right? But the format being as fast as it's been, a lot of the time I feel like I don't have time to ponder.
Sure. I can see that.
It's just like I need to either hold up some kind of interaction, or like if I ponder and I go shields down, then I'm sort of compelled to like up my force count, which also dilutes my deck to some capacity. Like I just find that like in the early turns of the game where it's like you both need to develop and like you just don't have time to spend cantripping because, Ancient Tomb will just like either lock you out, or the combo decks will just go too fast. Or it's like if you ponder and then go shields down in response to like Entomb. So it's like if you didn't have the interaction before you pondered anyway, then they still got you, because then they get to untap and interact with you on their terms while you're tapped out. Like it just seems like if there's the combination of ponder may be too slow in a format that's fast, and there are tools that maybe can attack a metagame at large, is it necessary? Like, I don't know. It sort of just made me question the sacred cows.
Yeah.
Well,
I think it's healthy to explore that and try and see if that's how we get deck innovation is like, someone goes, well, what if I just jam all these, Urza's Baubles and Mishra's Baubles into a deck full of artifact creatures that care about how many artifacts you have to play and stuff like that. That's how we get different kinds of decks. So I think it's worth trying to do that, and even as a thought experiment, just to keep your mind limber.
Yeah, it just makes me think that like there are enough things that care about different card types in different places, and casting spells just for the sake of casting them, or I mean, I've been playing against a lot of Dimir tempo, and like the Delirium clause on Nethergoyf. It's like I get that it wants lands in the yards, but I typically find that like it's too slow for it to be an effective rebuy because getting the delirium effects. But it's like if you minimized if you differentiated rather than just playing Mishra's Bauble, it's like you play the additional stuff to Xerox yourself, considering that the deck can operate on effectively 2 lands at most anyway.
Yeah.
I don't know. It just like there, I feel like there's space. Like maybe I'm wrong. I could very well be wrong. I'm probably wrong, but like I've been thinking about this deeply enough that like either I'm way off the deep end because there's nothing else that I can think about for control going forward, or it's just enough underexplored space that if there was enough brain power behind it, maybe there actually is something that is more powerful than what fetch lands operate, because we're in a space where the format is so fast that the leverage that you would get from being able to go fetch Brainstorm doesn't matter if you're not a combo deck that's trying to end the game after the first fetch land, or you're a combo deck that like or if you're a deck that like doesn't need or isn't interested in leveraging the surveil lands, right? Like every time I've played the surveil lands, I always feel like they're way too slow. Now, I think that the surveil lands are very good in place of decks that otherwise aren't cantripping. Like if you're a non-blue, like if you're a Maverick deck, or if you're combo that's looking for a very specific piece, or if you are just looking to try and have your surveil lands function as Entomb. But if you're just a deck that otherwise is looking to filter its draw and having access to a surveil land off of your fetch, like I have found that in my control deck, surveil lands have been pretty anemic. I'm like, okay, well, if I'm spending this mana to come into play tapped and expose myself further to wasteland, only to surveil, like if I'm not holding up some sort of like other alternative option like Spell Pierce or something, then I feel like that mana is just wasted anyway. And if I'm going to play a tap land that theoretically would slow me down, Mystic Sanctuary is just more powerful once we get to that stage of the game anyway.
Yeah, I think for your deck, Mystic Sanctuary is the better choice in that scenario, and because you only want so many of that kind of effect. And
totally,
what you're doing Mystic Sanctuary is so much more powerful than like put a random card in your graveyard. Like, yeah, occasionally they'll like play off each other, and you'll be like, man, I just really need to like get this Terminus in my hand out of my deck. I'll fetch, put Archive into play, Brainstorm while that triggers on its deck, put this Terminus on top of my deck, mill it, and then fetch and get like it's. I don't know. Like it seems like
essentially like there is enough going on where it's like, okay, if we're not going to have time to develop all that well anyway because of how fast the format is, then it's really tough to get to like be sandbagged with lands that you'll never actually get to play because the game will be over before that ever happens. And so if you think about like additional lands as just effectively being pseudo mulligans in a format that games are decided or effectively decided by turn 3, turn 4 tops if you've interacted at all, like it's like if you can minimize that and just be more dense, like in terms of like more spell dense or more interaction dense, that's meaningful. And the format is so fast between the Stompy decks and the Days Wasteland decks that you have to compress anyway. That, okay, if we accept that we have to compress, then mana bases also can be leaner because we have compressed. And if this sort of thing is just going to beget itself, then it just seems in theory that it's leading towards these ideas. Now I don't have it all fleshed out because you're catching me in the midst of working through it. But like I feel like everything else lends itself to being like, okay, yes, if all of these other things are true, then this must also be true, because it wouldn't make sense that we're playing a 20 land mana base, then and also our curve has dropped by 1.5 on average. Like it's like something doesn't line up here, right? Like if our curve was functional before, and we have since compressed our mana significantly in ways where it was still adaptive to getting wastelanded, like we could play through wasteland, then it wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't lose 40 pounds and then still assume that all of your clothes would fit the same way.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, all I can say, Phil, is that sounds like a lot of work. So I'm glad I'm glad you have the magic minds to go through that stuff. But for me, I'm just excited to be playing Rug Delver, man. I think this Friday I'm just gonna sleeve up Rug Delver and go to the local and see if I can win a half K.
I hope you win the half K. If anybody else is in this space, hit me up because we'll publish you on eternaldurdles.com. But until then, I'll let you know how Suppression Field goes.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody for watching. We will catch you next time. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help sustain the legacy content ecosystem. Just subscribing to this channel goes a long way to reminding YouTube that people love and support this format. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you should think about supporting us through Patreon. Both the links for subscription and Patreon are right here. And if you're listening on an audio format, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles. Thanks so much for watching.